One of the most challenging areas for new and emerging researchers and many postgraduate students is to understand the distinction between the results or the findings and the discussion section. Now, certainly when I was undertaking my postgraduate research, I was not clear about the distinction and I made many boo-boos. Now I'm always very clear about the distinction. I'm always trying to make a very clear distinction within every piece of my writing. Now, every section of my writing has a purpose. Every section has a distinct and specific job that it's trying to achieve. Now, when you think about it this way, there are in fact some very clear distinctions between the findings and the discussions. In a very simple sense, think about a statistical study. In a statistical study, my results or findings section is usually going to be very short. It's probably going to consist primarily of some data and some tables showing the results. What did I find from doing the analysis? I plan to do, for example, a covariance-based structured equation model analysis using AMOS. My results section is showing what I found. I wanted to do a study. It's a path-based study in that case. What did I find? What are these relationships? How strong are they? What does that model look like? Results. The more interesting thing from a research perspective is certainly what do those results mean? What do we know now, having done this study, that we did not know before? That's our discussion section. So let's get the separation here between the results and the discussion section. It's easy with those statistically based studies. Results tends to be tables. It tends to be very clearly distinct and different to a written description of the meaning of what I have found. Now, when you think about it this way, the results, the findings, this is reporting. There is no interpretation. There's no sense making. There is no meaning. This is what I found. This is the outcome from the method section. This is the method, and here are my results. This is what I am reporting back to you. Full stop, period, end of story. The discussion section will be different because we're making that comparison and because we're then explaining the meaning and explaining the contribution in the discussion section. We need to bring in those past studies. And so the results section is reporting on what we found. It will be output. It will be showing and demonstrating the outcome from our research. Now, when you think about this, there's also another useful clue here. The results or findings section is reporting our results. The discussion section is making sense of the results with and using past studies. What does this indicate? It indicates very simply that in the results of the findings section versus the discussion section, there's going to be a big difference, a very visible and easily observable difference in terms of the in-text citations and what we are talking about and how we are talking about it. So if I'm reading a student's work, for example, and I'm looking at the results in the discussion section, if they've merged the two together entirely by accident, and this is by no means an insult to these students because, look, everyone's doing their best. But if I'm finding that there's a bit of a merge there, or there's a run-on section, or they're talking about results and then some discussions and then some more results and then some more discussions, it's usually clear how we can cut these sections apart and separate them out with a very simple trick. Look for the citations will belong in the discussion section. The results is just that reporting, the dry reporting what was found in the study. And that is a really interesting distinction. It's a very simple hack that allows you to quickly pull apart your own writing, quickly assess your own writing, but distinguishing between reporting and making sense of and discussing those findings. Do this in your dissertation, in your thesis, and it makes for a very clear distinction between the two sections. Now, to make things a little bit more complex, in some cases, in some disciplines, with some supervisors, and also when we look at some published studies, it's not always going to be as clear-cut. Now, personally, I do enjoy those clear-cut sections of the results, the discussions, and then a conclusion. Now, depending on advisors and supervisors, depending on editors and reviewers, we may sometimes see changes made to these sections. For example, one of our studies in the International Journal of Production Economics, we received the feedback from the reviewers, the editors agreed with this, that the discussions in the conclusion section were repeating information. What's the point of repeating information needlessly within a research article? And they simply pointed out, look, if we take these two sections and we join them together or merge them together, we have a conclusions and discussion section, or a discussions inclusion and conclusion section, and we can eliminate this repetition here. So you'll sometimes see findings or results and a discussions and conclusions section wrapped up together. But even within the conclusions and discussion section, we're going to see a couple of really key and distinguishing features there, where we pull apart the conclusions of the study and make a very clear distinction on very different paragraphs between the conclusions and those discussion points, where we're talking about past studies and making some comparisons and explaining the importance and the findings of our research study in relationship to those past studies. But we'll almost always see the results held separate. We'll almost always see those results as a separate section. Now, this is also really important when we're thinking about a thesis or a dissertation. Why, you might ask? The answer is very simple. An examiner will want to see what you found. Now, in a very simple sense, you have your method section. That was your plan. The results section or the findings section is what you found. Now, in some ways, this speaks to the level of analysis that you have undertaken. It speaks to the level of care. It speaks to the thoroughness of your analysis. It speaks to whether or not you knew what you were doing when you talked about the method. It speaks to whether or not you just used a cookie cutter method, whether or not you just copied something out of a book, or whether or not you really understood that process. And that is going to be very clear and very apparent to your examiners as they look at that results section. The results section in a qualitative or an interview-based or a case study section, it's going to look very different than it is with a statistical section. And this is where I see more students struggling to separate the two out. And again, I'm going to go back to this idea of reporting on what we found versus making sense. Again, in a very simple sense, if there's citations in the paragraph is probably more likely to be shifted into the discussion section, because if I've got citations, I'm making sense of the findings. I'm making a comparison. I'm drawing conclusions about what I found versus what has been found before. In a very simple sense then, in the qualitative studies, the reportings, the findings will often be, for example, rich quotes from the participants showing their understanding of that phenomenon. It might include visual elements, a chart showing how some of these relationships are interconnected. It might include a table or a figure showing, for example, high-level themes and some of the codes or the categories that sit within that theme, including perhaps some elements there of individual quotes. Now, that's also an interesting point when we're thinking about the results section. The individual quotes, those individual snippets of text from our participants, we want to provide evidence that we've got the data and that's connected to these themes. Now, for examiners, I don't have the time nor the energy, and they also don't have access to that rich set of data. They don't have the time to examine it, they don't have access to it. What we as researchers need to do is we need to demonstrate there's a connection between this data, between these interview transcripts and these high-level themes that we often produce in qualitative research. Now, a simple way of doing this is a figure. Here's the high-level theme. Here are some codes within the theme or some categories of issues within the theme. And then here are some representative quotes. Now, for the examiner, this allows them to see or get a sense of that raw data, as well as how that connects through to those high-level themes within our study. For the examiner, this then provides them with evidence. It provides them with just a glimpse, a snippet, a glance of your process. And it gives them reassurance that you haven't just created or manufactured these themes, that these themes are in fact grounded in your underlying data, within those transcripts, within those company documents. There's a connection between those documents and these themes, and here is a trail, here is a chain, a connection between data and findings. Now, those themes, those categories, those codes, this is all findings that you might see reported in that findings section. Now, as we describe it this way, that findings section is going to be bigger, it's going to be more expansive than we might see in a survey-based piece of research in the business school. That's okay. But with qualitative studies, it tends to mean it's going to be more tricky for us then to distinguish between the findings and the discussion section. But I believe making that distinction is going to be of vital importance. Now, in a simple sense with a qualitative study, findings would be something like themes and categories and codes and rich snippets, rich insight from our participants. And then in the discussion section, so what do these themes mean? So what does the relationship between these themes mean for us? How does this relate to what has been found before? A clear distinction between findings and discussions. Yes, you can do it. Keep it simple, keep it structured, and that, my friends, is the key to success.